Very good morning, everybody. Let us begin today's session. So today, actually, we are going to look at a very important topic within sustainable development. We have been talking about, principles, pathways, outcomes, the sustainable development goals themselves. Today, we are looking at how policy and planning can help in the practice of these goals, okay, in mainstream. So let us go into today's class. Today, two important themes are essential for discussion. One are the policy perspectives aligned to the sustainable development goals themselves. And the second is practical application, which we will deal with case studies. So now we've seen yesterday that there are what we actually sat and saw in detail. What are the targets and indicators for each of the SDGs, right? So I also mentioned to you, SDGs have evolved over an expanded process of years of multiple stakeholder consultations, and there have been, agreement on some and disagreements which came out of these consultations, which required intergovernmental negotiations to come up with the final set of 169 targets that we have today. So these actually, we can see that it is an immense number. 169 is a huge number. So there ought to be synergies. Synergies is how well some of these goals are aligned with each other. And there are trade-offs. One cancelling the goal of other. This is also a possibility. So we are going to see these aspects in detail today. And we should understand that accounting for them is very, very necessary. If we see the strengths and limitations as shown here, if we see the strengths of sustainable development goals, one thing is that they're exhaustive, as I mentioned to you, and they are multidimensional. So it covers every aspect of life from social, economic, as well as environmental dimensions. So it is multidimensional. And third thing is there is a huge possibility here for sectoral integration and synergism, which was not possible earlier. So having this framework as sustainable development goals gives us that opportunity to address intersectoral and intrasectoral practices in general to lead towards sustainability. So this is the actual three strengths of sustainable development goals. If we look at limitations, okay, one very, very important limitation is there can be overlapping goals. Like I mentioned to you a couple of them yesterday, we will also see some today. What are the overlapping goals? One set of goals from one SDG can overlap with another SDG as well. But the targets or the indicators for each of these SDGs are going to be different. So how do we evaluate them? So that is actually overlapping of goals. Second is contradicting other goals. For example, we can have, two goals, climate action and industries, right? So industrial innovation. There can be a clash between these goals. We are going to look at them with examples today. The third and very important contradiction or limitation is that there can be one goal which has to be reinforced over other goals. So does that mean that each of these goals are not important or equally important? So that comes to our mind. So these three limitations, overlapping contradictory goals as well as reinforcement over other goals, make it very important for us to understand what are the trade-offs from using sustainable development goals. Now we have seen this graph yesterday. I actually want to project this today with a different perspective. Okay. So if you look at this graph again, let us go one by one. Yesterday, we saw this from measuring or the indicators point of view. Are the indicators aligned to the targets or the goals themselves? Today, we are going to look at it as goals versus goals, right? Not just from the indicator point of view, what each of these goals are going to put forth as targets for sustainability. If you see again, let us start from the left-hand side top. Control of emissions and emissions, right? So this is the goal. But does this goal contradict the goal on increased cost of living, right? And the inequalities decrease. For example, the money paid by the city administration for controlling is going to increase if we are going to have more control mechanisms in place. So that will reflect upon, in general, increased cost of living for the citizens of that place, right? So that we have to understand. But that actually impact the goal on achieving equality among the community? So there is going to be, maybe we foresee that there can be a trade-off from this. Although there is going to be a synergy with environmental degradation control, there is also going to be a trade-off. Similarly, if we see the next one, the goal is efficient use of resources. Here the clash would be between the goal of having efficient resources reuse versus the goal of lowering energy consumption, right? So there is going to be an intersectoral clash here, if you say. Next, if you see again, private versus public investments, there is going to be a clash when we are thinking only about target-oriented education and training. So private, as we had a good discussion during the question and answer sessions yesterday, where we discussed how the private versus public players in education are going to influence the way in which the learning is facilitated in different educational institutions. For example, the private players can look at some targeted education and training in terms of bringing up, people, employees who will aid in the industrial innovation and entrepreneurship sector, whereas more of R&D may be required for as per the public spending on education. So here the goals between public education and the goals of private education are clashing in between. So again, there is going to be a clash between the goals. There can be. Next, if we see the goal of regionalization itself, there can be actually a clash between how the markets are placed. So the goal is, as we saw, one of the goals is to promote small scale traders and small scale markets and local markets and indigenous markets. Are we going to use this to create what are known as sustainable communities, or are we going to push forward the producers from the small scale sector and the indigenous sector and sell this in a place where the profits will be higher, but the markets are distally placed? So it means that there is going to be a policy issue here, which is going to bring a clash between realization of the goals themselves, which is sustainable, whether selling here or selling there, because the question now is improving the infrastructure for indigenous or local or small scale traders at a given place versus improving their profits in a distant place. So here again, there is a clash of SDGs. Now, if you see another goal, the protection of natural ecosystems itself has a goal. Here we are actually there are multiple dimensions to this, and we cannot exhaustively discuss every other SDG goal with this, because this is actually a key to sustainability itself. But what we can understand is that there are certain goals which commit to the economic stability leading to sustainable communities versus economic stability of industrial infrastructure and innovation, where there is going to be a clash between the goals, how the industries see that. We have already discussed the different aspects or perspectives of sustainability earlier, if you will recall, how the industry sees sustainability is different from how environmentalists and the sociologists see sustainability. So the clash is going to come from the definition or the target orientedness of these SDG goals themselves. Next, if you see, the great variety of people living together is a goal which is very, very important to the society to maintain equality. But what about gender disparities? That could actually have a clash between having sustainable communities living together where the inequality is reduced versus where gender inequality is being reduced. So there is going to be a clash between these goals. Finally, if we see like also in terms of strengthening participation, there can be a clash between local and national goals. So we have to understand that despite all these clashes, we have to first examine the nature, magnitude, and potential implications of these SDGs interdependencies. Okay, so where they are interdependent upon each other. This is not basically a clash, but it is more of a trade-off or an interdependency, which we have to examine, and we have to prioritize this if we have to prioritize the spending in one particular perspective. Let us see this with example. Now, with our idea of where there can be interdependencies and there can be clashes, we, the policy makers, have two different approaches to take. One approach is a defensive approach. Another approach is called the proactive approach. So the defensive approach goes like this. First, policies are formed based on whatever SDG targets are set, and we wait how the policy effect takes place. We wait and watch the impacts. Then we look for bones of contention or points of contention where there is a clash between these SDGs, and we fix them using other additional policies. So this is one aspect, one approach. Another approach is to first itself map the interdependencies and frame policies which will actually target these interdependencies based on identifying the nature. And then we align policy making to disengage these contentious nodes from the beginning so that the policy itself becomes very robust. Always the proactive approach takes precedence over the defensive approach, because one thing that we have to understand, okay, we are talking about these two approaches. In practical terms, both of these approaches are happening. Both of these approaches are adopted by policymakers for different reasons. For example, in nations which are developing or least developed nations, where the capital GNI or gross national income is low or medium, they will try to take the defensive approach, right? Because of certain reasons. One reason, as we have seen, which are also challenges for sustainability, is that first we will have lack of data, which can help us to assess these interdependencies very well. We'll have the lack of methodology, the element of methodology to put this framework in place, and we may lack tools for implementation, as we have seen yesterday. So here the defensive approach takes precedence over the proactive approach, that is actually depending on the economic structure of a particular nation. That also we have to understand, and we have to compromise that. But the proactive approach is always the better approach, because it will start from the beginning, mapping the interdependencies where likely the clash of goals could be between the SDGs if they are implemented. We also have to now understand, we are talking about a framework. That framework is being set for each of the nations, right? So the SDGs are framework. We are adopting that framework to our national scenario. So if we adopt these goals, there can be, in our specific context, there can be clashes between SDGs. So we take a proactive approach to find out where these contentious nodes are in the beginning itself, and we disengage them by having policies which will not interfere with each other. So this leads to what is known as a proactive approach. Now it is very interesting that the SDGs themselves are being studied for these interdependencies and studied for their consistencies. So here you can see one particular chart, which is the goal interaction scaling. So this actually is a very good way to understand the SDG interactions. It is given by Nielsen et al. I have given the source for this. I would recommend everybody to go and read this very, very important publication. But what we are understanding today together is, you see there is a score from -3 to +3, and there are different levels. What this scoring has done is take all the SDGs to a particular context and see if the SDGs between themselves are consistent enough to achieve overall sustainability, or do they enable each other? Do they have a positive effect on each other, or do they have a negative effect on each other? So it's a very, very useful way to score the interactions between SDGs. Let us start. We have to spend some time to understand this. Let us start from the consistent scoring, which is a neutral scoring, 0. Okay, so a neutral relationship says that the objective between the SDGs does not significantly alter the nature of its implementation. It's neither positive nor negative. It is just implemented. Here we have to understand we are not talking about the effects of SDGs on the society or on our environment or on our economy. We are talking about how the interaction between SDGs will not cancel, reinforce one over the other, or it will not overlap between each other. So we're talking about the pairing or the the interaction or interdependencies between SDGs. Here it means there is no clash basically. Let's start with the positive scaling first. Now the next you can say the score is 1, says it is enabling. It means that the pursuit of objectives for one set of SDGs will enable the achievement of another set of SDGs, right? So it has a positive effect. Example here given is providing electricity access to rural homes will also increase the pursuit of education. So 2 SDG goals are met. Also, it is also gives an opportunity for the rural poor to work to seek employment opportunities, and also increases the safety in the streets, giving a safe work environment, as also safety in the streets and living environments. And it enables more women to participate in education in evening schools or part-time education. So this is an enabling trend. One SDG enables the other SDG. If you see the positive score 2, it is reinforcing. Is positive reinforcement, there can be negative reinforcement also, which is counteractive. Okay, so here we are talking about positive reinforcement. One objective directly creates the conditions that lead to the achievement of other objective. Okay, so here there is a increase or incremental approach to achieving SDGs. Here, for example, given here is increasing the resilience and adaptive capacity to climate change will also reduce the losses caused due to disasters. So here, achieving infrastructural gains will satisfy achievement of disaster preparedness and disaster resilience. Okay, so here is a very good example. Another example given is providing the access to electricity. It will reinforce the water pumping and irrigation systems, right? So 2 SDGs are met, one SDG being the condition for achieving the other SDG to a enhanced level. So that is reinforcing. This is actually a very synergistic approach, enabling and reinforcing synergistic approaches. The third one and the highest score on the positive scale is the strongest form of positive interaction, in which one objective is inextricably related to the achievement of another. So only in the presence, see, in reinforcement scale and enabling scale, there are different degrees to which one SDG becomes enabler for the other SDG. Okay, but in indivisible, there is an integrated approach or a composite achievement of SDGs. So here, example given here is ending all forms of discrimination against women and all women and girls everywhere. So this is an indivisible SDG, which will itself help to assure the decrease in gender disparity, in increasing the the parity indices, in improving the leadership capabilities and managerial positions and roles for women. So these are indivisible. Achieving one SDG is very much interlinked to the other SDGs. The interdependency is huge here, right? But the positive nature of outcome is also very huge. So this is actually another, the example of SDG 4 as education. Giving quality education is also an indivisible SDG, which will, as I said, help us to achieve all the other SDGs. Okay, so let us go to the negative side of this. If we see the constraining score of -1, this is a mild form of negative interrelationship where the pursuit of one objective sets a condition on the achievement of another SDG. Right, so pursuing one set of targets, like for example, the objectives for using agricultural water use the conditions which how irrigation can be provided. So there is a mild interaction. So here the change in climate mitigation, another example given, the climate change mitigation also keeps a condition on how energy access and use is happening. Another example is that the developmental strategies which are sustainable over time are based on the industrial innovations. So these are three different examples where the rehabilitation cost, the use of the natural resource basis, and the use of conditionalities are mild in nature. But it is still possible to achieve both these sets of SDGs by themselves to have some sort of synergistic effect in a little while, right? In some time. If we see the counteracting effects, so the pursuit of one objective, which has a score number -2, counteracting, the pursuit of one objective counteracts another objective. This is a more stricter form, right? It's not mild. So one can have a negative effect on the other. For example, counteracting the reduction of waste and greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, this can actually increase the human habitation's vulnerability to flooding. So reducing waste and greenhouse gas emissions means putting, in one sense, reducing waste is maybe creating infrastructures which will help to recycle this waste, which means creating more of impervious spaces, and also having, increasing the greenhouse gas emissions. This can also have a negative effect on climate, as well as that is, the infrastructure spending on decreasing the greenhouse gas emissions will actually have a clash with the economic growth, which can have an indirect clash with how the infrastructures for resilience to disasters can also change. That actually is also linked to agriculture and drought prone areas, which where the increasing the human habitation or the population or the human resources in these areas can have a negative effect on how the flood control or the agriculture or drought proneness can change over the period of time. So here actually there are multiple things. We start with economic growth and we continue our relationships, the negative relationships of achieving other targets in terms of the economic growth itself, because that is actually linked to, in one SDG, reduction of waste, in another SDG, greenhouse gas emissions, and in another reduction, increasing or the resilience, disaster resilience, and decreasing the flood proneness or the effect on human habitations. But the important social targets of these SDGs can lead actually to decreased resilience as well. So the social aspect is also very, very keen here, because if we have a decreased resilience, if we have an increased human habitation around flood prone areas, we can also, expect disaster resilience to be lesser in terms of flood proneness itself. But we also need, this is why have we taken flood proneness here or disaster scenario here? Because we have to understand that many of the important economic centers in the world are situated in the coastline, where the flood proneness or the disaster proneness or vulnerability to natural hazards are huge or immense. And these economic centers are where the achievement of economic activity is highest. That means if we want more of economic activity or output, we have to employ more human resources. When we have more human resources, we are increasing the human habitation, and we are putting a load on how much of disaster resilience these areas can offer, right? So this is actually counteracting SDGs. The last or the highest form of -3, which is shown here, are cancelling in nature, right? SDGs cancel each other. The most negative interaction, where the progress in one goal is cancelling the progress in another goal, and possibly also leads to a deteriorating state of what it was in the beginning. So example is, national security objectives can make it impossible to have fully transparent and accountable institutions, which we saw in SDG 16 and SDG 17 yesterday, right? So although SDG 16 and 17 are very important SDGs, it is not always possible to realize their targets because of other concerns. Even within SDG 16, you see there are cancelling SDG targets as in between 16 and 17 as well. Another example is protection of nature reserves versus public access to improve sustainable lifestyles, right? So also for recreational purposes, we saw the tourism potential or ecotourism should be increased, but it will cause more deterioration of the natural environment because tourism activities always pollute more than they contribute more. So here there is a clashing of SDGs. Another example is access by pastoralists who traditionally traverse the reserve during their seasonal migrations, right? So that is also going to endanger our target on protecting indigenous communities. So here, indigenous and migrant communities. Here, so we have to actually, understand that all the SDGs are not always cancelling. We saw a few examples in the earlier slide, which tells us that there can be several degrees to which these trade-offs happen and several degrees to which the synergies happen. So it is up to us to map out these interactions in the beginning itself to have a proactive planning as we have seen earlier. Now moving on, there are two different considerations to actually produce proactive policies. One is to understand the policy dimension and another is to understand the policy coherence aspects. So if we look at policy dimension aspect, there are 4 different steps which have to be taken to consider a policy which will be very, very robust. First is to contextualize the synergies and trade-offs as we have seen today. Next is to assess case-specific factors which will impact the way in which the SDGs are actually implemented. So this is actually another very, very important consideration that we have to take. Third thing is directionality and symmetricity of interlinks have to be considered. Okay, so there is a unidirectional and a bidirectional symmetricity of the interlinks. We will talk about this with examples a little later, but we have to understand that this also has to be preserved to achieve certain SDGs with positive outcomes rather than negative outcomes. And finally, considering the time dependency of the policy approach itself is very important to have a successful proactive SDG based policy. Now, if we look at what is known as coherence, coherence is how well the policy is aligned to practice or planning within a given context. So this coherence aspects are also very important for creating a successful proactive policy. First, if we see, there are different types of coherence relationships. First relationship, as discussed by Nielsen, is sectoral coherence, that is coherence between policy sectors, right? So each policy sector, by policy sector we mean industrial sector, domestic sector, and maybe the environmental sector. There has to be a coherence in the policies that these are taking together to achieve a particular outcome or particular target of SDG. Second type of coherence, one thing we have to understand, it is not possible to have all types of coherence in one particular policy planning practice within a nation. We can try to achieve some of this. It is not always possible to have all the policy coherence in place, right? But we have to understand there are different types of coherence which we can actually try to achieve. Second type here is transnational, that is between jurisdictions, between districts and states, or between the states and and also between the wards. So if a ward has a policy that we're going to preserve our parks, it should be in coherence with the district wise approach, which says yes, parks, this district will have park preservation policy. So it has to be a coherent policy alignment. But if the district says that the number of parks has to be reduced, but more spending is ward wise on parks, then there is no policy coherence. So that is a very important consideration. Another consideration is governance between interventions. If we are taking an active intervention, say an emission is emission prevention intervention, that has to be aligned through local administrative versus state and central administration. So the interventions should be common and agreed upon so that there is coherence in the policy with which this emission control itself is taken forth. So there is governance coherence. Next level of coherence is multi-level coherence, where there is a consonance between the global agreement and the national policy making. So national policy making itself should not contradict the global agreements. In this case, let us take the case of SDGs. So the national policy should not be against the achievement of SDGs. And finally, the implementation aspect through which from the objective till the practice, the policy is aligned. There is no actual clash between the policy aspects. So now let us look at these policy dimensions and coherence aspects with some examples. So here you see, there is actually a goal. Okay, so the goal is that by 2030, the EU should aim to achieve certain level of energy for transportation, by which the biofuels constitute about 14% in a minimum and 3.5% in advanced biofuels, and all EU countries are required to set out an obligation to achieve this target. So this is the goal by 2030 that European Union has set. Here we are discussing what is known as geographic dependency, geographic scale dependency, where the European Union's policy with biofuels need to be examined. Now we have a case study. The case study shows us that while contextualizing the synergies and trade-offs, first we have to discuss what are the trade-offs and synergies. Let us look at the synergies. Okay, so there are three possible policy scenarios here. The first scenario, when we say biofuels, the biofuels are generated from biofuel, right? So it's generated from crop residues or crops which are actually cultivated for this purpose alone. So that is going to occupy some of the place where the food grains are grown or the essential agricultural commodities are grown. So there is going to be a clash between achieving two different goals here. So the European Union now, with its policy to increase biofuel usage, has to consider how it can deal with the agricultural aspect. So this is where our synergy should lead to, having both the energy efficiency and use aspect covered as well as food security aspect covered. So the three different scenarios with us now are: one is to strengthen bioenergy production ahead of food production. Number two is to strengthen food security ahead of bioenergy. And number three is to strengthen international trade patterns ahead of the national goals themselves to maintain the supply chain, which will essentially be important to have sustainable communities. So A, B, C are three synergies. We call them synergies because these are aligned to many of the sustainable development goals of achieving food security, of achieving energy efficiency, of having clean fuels, and also to strengthen international trade, right? So these are three different goals which we foresee to be synergies, but there is going to be trade-off. The trade-off is, first trade-off is, if we are going to concentrate on bioenergy production, the food production is going to go down. Second trade-off is that the farmers and foresters have to be, they have to be ousted out of their land through which they have, through generations, grown agricultural produces, through use of that particular land for cultivating bioenergy crops. The third trade-off is that the international trade patterns themselves will dictate what they want. Okay, so if for example, the export is more on agricultural commodities, then the EU has to decide where it has to compromise between agricultural produce versus bioenergy produce. So the demand is high. It has to go and cater to the high demand, right? So the scenario is little different here. Now we have to, when we're contextualizing, the policy options available are, should we incentivize the food grain production? which means if we are incentivizing it, more of food grain production is increased. But achieving the goal, the one on the top left hand side, if you will see, by 2030, achieving that goal may not come through. So there is going to be a mild actually clash between these two. But if we incentivize, for example, biofuel crops, then the availability of food grains will decrease and they have to be imported from outside, which means that the import duty is going to increase for the EU. If we leave both these and we actually concentrate on preserving the land and the forest, so should forest conservation be incentivized, which will help actually to have the nutrients stored in the soil for a much longer time and also help in long-term sustainability. Whereas agriculture, we know agriculture, mining, all these activities will deplete the land resources over long term. So the consideration now is between also not just the gains from anthropogenic activities, but also between long-term and short-term sustainability. Finally, should we prioritize free flow of trade operations? So this was the question between the different European Union countries. Now, if we see the geographic dependency, you see that I have actually clustered. We see three different clusters in the bottom. The clusters are clusters of Scandinavian countries within the European Union, Nordic countries within the European Union, and other countries in the European Union. If you see the middle one, the Nordic countries, which include, apart from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, also Finland and Iceland, they are very, very actually rich countries where carbon neutrality is very high and the precedence is given for conservation rather than production as such or pollution and degradation of the environment. But in the Scandinavian countries, the economic aspects also increase because they are also actually very high performers on the international trade front, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden especially. And they also actually at the same time prioritize carbon neutrality agreements and also increase the use of biofuels much more than the Nordic countries. And there are other countries in the EU which also take a differential stand on all these approaches. So how can we achieve, even within this geographic area, transnational coherence with respect to the policies? So the policies here need, what came out of this study is that the interdependencies were identified. So the percentage of biofuel crops was actually synergized with the food production through the food crops, so that it did not affect how the agricultural commodities came into the country and also established the supply pattern internationally for agricultural exports as well as food product exports. So actually we get a lot of these jams, Danish jams, and several other agricultural agro-based products from these countries, Scandinavian countries, which fetch huge profits for them. So that was actually, the concept where they said that the biofuels should, advanced biofuels and use of biofuels should not compromise how much of food grain or the agricultural exports are made from the country, from the European Union. So there was a differential policy. For example, 1 and A, the scenario that strengthening bioenergy ahead of food production may have been a Scandinavian choice at some point, but the Nordic choice of strengthening food security ahead of bioenergy production was taken with the policy aspect to incentivize conservation. Although 1 and A combination put bio or clean fuel energy on the forefront, we have to understand the policy coherence was more sectoral in this than the other policy sector, where the Nordic countries, they decided to put the food security ahead of bioenergy production, which means the DNS part of Nordic behaved a little differently or adopted policies a little differently from the other countries. And the other countries which were dependent on export incomes, they actually decided to establish the trade patterns incentivize free flow of trade operations than conservation or adoption of clean fuels. So this actually gives an example of how the clash between the SDGs have happened, but it was contextualized. And as you can see that the per capita income of all these countries are huge, are very, very high. These are wealthiest nations in the world. So that is why we have taken this example to analyze how the synergies and trade-offs are controlled, okay, through the policy perspective, so that the national incomes from the food grains and exports did not compromise their energy production. Okay, we cannot go into very in-depth analysis right now, but if you are interested, we can do it a little later, because we first I have to understand the context of these policy interventions. So that is where we are placed today. And having understood this, we have to analyze each policy that each of this country has taken, which has led to the result that I have described to you right now. But we have to understand that on the scale of coherence, the coherence is more of a transnational coherence, which takes precedence over sectoral or governance coherence, right? Okay, so next case study. I'm going to introduce you to something with some approach, which is called the environmental Kuznets curve. Let us go a little technical in this way. Let us first understand this Kuznets curve. Kuznets curve actually says that with increased economic growth, the environmental degradation first increases and then reduces. You see the inverted U kind of shape of the graph in the center of your screen. So that is known as an environmental Kuznets curve. How this was derived is through analysis, statistical and regression analysis of variety of data sets from different countries over different periods in time. And this curve actually, it was plotted to show that this trend is observed first with economic growth. First, it is prioritized. It is not environmental degradation or reclamation. The aspects, these are not considered in the beginning, but with more and more of economic growth, the environmental degradation increases first. Then, as more of awareness comes in and more of the outcomes of this degradation set in, the economic growth itself declines, but environmental degradation, economic growth increases, but environmental degradation declines, even when the economic growth is high. So there are three different options now. So here you can see Stern et al. Say that the environmental Kuznets curve hypothesis is that there is an inverted U relationship between economic growth and environmental damage. So here when we consider, there are three different case-specific factors which are involved in use of this Kuznets curve approach. One is that we have to understand what are the changes in the outputs composition from the economic activities itself. Second is introduction or the use of cleaner technologies, cleaner production technologies. And third is to increase the public demand on control of emissions. So all these three scenarios are very case specific, which can lead to the formation of environmental Kuznets curve over time, if actually they are employed in the policy perspective. So these change actually can lead to a decline as well as negative or marginal change in pollution with increasing per capita incomes. Okay, so this is the basic concept. Now we see another definition which says a quantile. We need to understand what a quantile is. A quantile is a unit from regression, which unit means it is a measure or an output from regression analysis, which estimates the conditional median of the response variable, identifying the factors which are the greater determinants of the outcomes of variable interactions under categorized subgroups. It all seems a little technical, but what it actually means is, if we consider the case specific factors which are listed in the box on your right hand side, the quantiles can indicate how the use of these case specific factors can actually determine the higher output. The higher output here we mean is lowering environmental degradation, and increased economic growth. Okay, so quantiles are indicative of the case, the success of the case specific factors if they are taken in context. So now let us actually use one case study given by Sinha et al. To understand this. Okay, so Sinha et al. What they did, they took data from several hundreds, several about not 100, about 50 Asia Pacific countries, and they actually studied the data from the effect of economic activity or technological advancement on the environmental quality. So for this, they did this for the period from 1990 to 2017. What they did is exactly this. They did the environmental or EKC analysis, and they found out what are known as the quantiles. So we have understood EKC and quantiles, what they are. With that understanding, there are 4 different considerations that came out of this study, which are listed here. First is that they said that the impact of technology policies on environmental quality showed that there can be actually clashes between achievement of targets between SDGs, which I have highlighted here, which we are going to discuss. But they also found that the reality of inverted U-shaped EKCs was actually prevalent from the data which were analyzed from these Asia Pacific countries. Also, a very, very important aspect of this research is that they indicate what are known as turnaround points, when economic growth will not contribute to environmental damage, but will increase environmental quality on the whole. That is a turnaround point. So here they established turnaround points from the data that they have analyzed, and they say that the comprehensive SDG framework can be established based on this analysis. So now what is the policy implication that we are taking, right? The policy implication is that using EKCs along with quantile analysis and causality test can be a very, very good methodological element to assess the case specific factors which lead to the decline in environmental degradation and long-term sustainability, even with high income, economic growth and high income. So this can be a very effective example for governance coherence, right? So let us look at this chart that is put here, which will help us to understand these turnaround points better. Now, if you see at the bottom, the achievement of targets for renewable energy consumption is actually clashing with technological advancement, right? So the renewable energy consumption cannot actually satisfy all the industrial outputs or technological advancements in a particular fashion, so that industrial outputs are optimized. But if you see, it can satisfy 2 different goals, the goals of SDG 7 and goals of SDG 13. Now, if we see goals of SDG 7, which actually lead to which deal with clean energy and energy efficiency, clash rather with those of having sustainable communities to some extent, but it is a mild form of clash. But if you see, the synergistic effect between SDG 7 and 13 is evident here. But if we add now the countries, Asia Pacific countries, some of these actually prioritized one particular type of approach. First, implementing the SDGs of first implementing the targets of SDG 7 and 13, then implementing the target of SDG 8. Now here what happens is that the SDG 8, okay, which deals with actually reducing the inequalities, can actually have some targets which do not from SDG 13 contribute to it. So having more spending on climate control, as I earlier told you, can decrease the way in which the targets for SDG 8 are met. So there can be a mild form of trade-off between these 2 factors. So the interdependencies require more capital per capita spending from the countries to ensure that both the targets are met. But the synergism between SDG 7 and 13 lead to the achievement of the targets of SDG 8 itself. So that is actually a very good synergistic effect if we will see. Finally, achieving the targets of SDG 10 when it is actually, this is on phase 4. So this is one pathway. The second pathway is after having achieved SDG 7 and 13, go to achieving the targets of SDG 9, right? SDG 9, if it is not actually, which deals with industry innovation, by the way, industrial innovation can improve technological advancement in a country, but it can also be counteractive to many other SDGs or all the other SDGs which contribute to long-term sustainability. Because to maximize energy, industry and innovational outputs, we may need to use more of natural resources. Now we go back to our discussion on how the weak sustainability proponents are more techno-optimistic, and they consider that more of the natural capital can be converted to man-made capital, and it actually compromises or satisfies rather what the growth is about, right? So here it does actually look like if SDG 9 is taken up for implementation, which has happened through technological advancement, then it can compromise the achievement of the goals or targets of all the other SDGs. So now if we see now more of spending, government spending is required to see that this does not happen. So there is this mild form of interdependency which can become useful to us if we consider the targets of clean energy and energy efficiency through technological advancement, right? So now if we put in the bring the discourse or the spotlight on SDG 4, it helps us to, through education, through industry, technological education, through skill-based education, reduce energy wastage, material wastage, improve our material use efficiency or resource use efficiency, which all forms a part of achieving that goals of SDG 10. Okay, so sustainable communities and reduction in inequalities, SDG 8 and SDG 10 targets can be met if SDG 4 comes into picture. It negates or neutralizes the impacts of having only the targets of SDG 9 being realized. So here you see there is more spending which is required, which goes into the spending for SDG 4 targets achievement. So now if we see through this data set, so they have data of about 40 to 45 parameters which they have collected and put together. Then they analyzed this, they plotted the EKC, and then they found that when the mean per capita GNI, okay, GNI is gross national income, which also is an indication of how much the nation spends on achievement of the targets for sustainability also, right? So if the GNI is on the mean or average, and there is no excessive spending on achieving any of the targets, we can achieve what are known as low pollution scenarios. So here the turnaround points are within the sample ranges. Sample ranges here mean that what is the maximum and minimum spending in terms which will reflect on the economic growth aspects also for a particular country. So within the high minimum and maximum GNI, the low pollution scenario will evolve when it is around mean levels of GNI. If we see the medium pollution control, okay, so medium pollution control can be achieved if the maximum spending is scenario is established, which means that more of income has to be put. So now we discussed phase wise, and now we are discussing it as cumulative scenario wise, right? So if the country is spending maximum investments on having clean fuels and clean energy better communities, sustainable communities, better education, then it will achieve medium pollution. But the present policies with respect to how this can lead to medium pollution scenario will not be applicable to a high pollution control scenario at all, because even the spending is not enough to bring down the pollution. Okay, so even if we have all the SDG targets aligned and the synergistic placement of the targets, which will help us to achieve. So how do we place synergistically is by creating policies, how the targets will be realized at different levels, at different governance levels, right? So even if we have that, the high pollution scenario will not evolve. That means it indicates that there is inefficacy of policies at different levels, which will lead to policy discoherence at some level. Okay, so this case study shows us that governance coherence has to be established if the policy aspects have to improve and align the Asia Pacific countries, which are discussed in this particular case study, to increase the environmental protection and decrease pollution aspects as per this case study. So this is a very good example where on one side having a methodological element introduced into the policy analysis part, it can help in better planning, but at the same time it also shows or detects that the incoherence of policies and inefficacy of the policies can actually reduce the effectiveness of how the SDG targets are being met within the countries. I also encourage you to go and read this particular paper, which actually has very comprehensive discussions along with the methodology itself outlined, so that we can understand better how technology and methodology can help us to analyze the policy implications from ground zero up to the synergistic effects. Okay, so now the next dimension that we are discussing here is the directionality of the interlinks. Now the directionality can be two ways. It can be a unidirectional or a bidirectional. By unidirectional, we say that the interlink or interdependencies actually are linear. Okay, so linear, but also crucial. The interdependencies become crucial at some point, but they are mostly linear. I have given like two examples. One for unidirectional, if you see, the electricity access, which forms a part of our SDG 7 targets. Electricity access is needed to power hospitals and clinics. It can help us to achieve the goals of SDG 3, which is actually concerned with good health and well-being. But the targets of SDG 3 may not be the only means to achieve SDG 7. Okay, so the linear approach here is have SDG 7 targets to achieve SDG 3 targets. So that is our policy outline. But we cannot say that achieving SDG 3 can also have the help us to achieve the goals of SDG 7, because it requires some other SDGs. Like earlier we have seen the the SDG on innovation and industry, that is required. SDG on education is required. So all those are required to achieve the targets of SDG 7. This is an example of a unidirectional policy approach, which may or may not give the symmetricity for achieving the final end target. So if we have to place a policy implication, if we have to place our policy implication on achieving SDG 7 alone, okay, that the unidirectional mechanism may not be effective for us. Let us take the example of bidirectional approach. Use of appropriate personal mobility solutions will lead to reduction in climate change. So this is the hypothesis. So if we are going to have, say, e-bikes or electric bikes, if we increase that, that will help us to reduce the climate change impacts itself. And if the climate in turn will also influence the choice of our personal mobility. Okay, so if we have a policy which says that only electric bikes should be used, then the control on climate change is effective for us. But if we say that we are taking some climate related that is SDG to satisfy the targets of SDG 13, we're improving climate resilience in certain ways, it will definitely impact how we can use the existing mobility solutions at a cheaper cost, which will also increase our standard of living. So here the policy aspect can begin or end from either SDG 3, SDG 7, and end in SDG 13, or it can begin from SDG 13 and end in SDG 7 or 3. So here the bidirectional policy alignment is established. But we have to understand it is in practicality, it is not always possible to have a bidirectional approach to satisfy our target achievement. Many a times due to economic reasons, the unidirectional approach is preferred, which takes us back to the defensive approach versus the proactive approach. So it can lead to a defensive approach of satisfying the SDGs or implementing SDGs. So the policy implication here is that examining the directionality element will help us to determine what appropriate policies can be used for sustainability intervention. So here the policy aspect is interventional. So interventional coherence is very, very important aspect which we discuss now. So finally, and the final set of examples is time dependency. So not all SDG targets can take immense or a long period to achieve. The decisions may need to be taken at a shorter time period. For explaining this, let us stick to SDGs, SDG 2, and which deals with food security, and SDG 14, which deals with life below water. So here, if we say take two policies, policy number 1 and 2, if we are facing food shortage, one particular policy says have an increased use of fertilizers on land and grow more crops, harvest more, get more yields. So the short-term gains in getting the yields is satisfied. But if we take an alternate policy, policy number 2, to address food shortage, increase the use of local varieties, give more time for cultivation of local varieties, which may not result in short-term gains, but only long-term gains. Okay, so if we see the time dependency is higher actually here, because if we use fertilizers more and more in a longer period of time, we might have to face issues of land degradation at maximum. But if we use local varieties right now, the time taken for growth of these crops may be longer, but on the positive aspect of it, we will have long-term gains with respect to sustainability. Although it will be a longer time and the costs will be higher, the slower turnover rates can be achieved through this second policy. There will be lower costs for rehabilitation and lower costs for restoration. So next, if we take, so satisfying the goals of SDG 2 can take the form of having policy number 1 or policy number 2, which is actually also a governance coherence issue and a multi-level coherence consideration. Similarly, if we say SDG 14, low fish yields, they can be tackled by increasing the mechanized craft activity over a period of time, which will lead to short-term gains. But it will also deplete the overall stocks and the fish stocks over longer periods of time and ensuring low sustainability. So if we say policy number 4, which shows us that low fish yields can be tackled by increasing the stock diversification itself, which means that it will result in the long-term gains. So if we have the long-term gains in our as our criteria, we should adopt actually policy number 4. So this shows that although the implementation time and costs are short and the turnover rates are rapid and the costs of rehabilitation will be higher if we consider the policies which result in short-term gains. But if we actually consider the policies which gives us long-term sustainability perspectives, then actually the cost of restoration and rehabilitation decreases. So when we look at these aspects, we are bringing back to our discussion all that we discussed today, and we are putting all these aspects in perspective with how the policy aspects, the dimension as well as the coherence have to be tackled. So with that, I stop today. There are questions, we can actually take it forward. Thank you for listening and we hope for more interactions. Thank you.